Okay, can you see now? Okay, cool. Okay, now we're on. Wow, that was weird. Okay, we're going to do present. So let's go back and talk about this. So yes, all energy on Earth comes from the sun. We know that. All energy on Earth comes from the sun. We can see that. Now, why isn't it there? And why isn't my camera on? Okay, let me untab me and we'll see. All energy on Earth comes from the sun. And we said that it doesn't matter where it comes from, but all that energy is going to be captured primarily, mostly in plants. And plants use that energy from the sun to keep that energy and make it into food. So plants turn all the energy from the sun using photosynthesis to make food in plants. So all of the energy for every other animal, every other organism is made by plants using photosynthesis, okay, which I think we all remember. And we said that it doesn't matter where this energy comes from in different ecosystems. That was another key word, different ecosystems. We said that it always comes to sunshine and it enters the ecosystem. It can be a desert ecosystem, or it can be a forest ecosystem. It could also be a marine ecosystem. It could be a tundra ecosystem. It doesn't matter. All the energy, every single bit of energy, only comes from one place, the sun. It's only captured as food in one place, which is in plants. Now, there was a key word we used last week because plants are the only organisms which make their own food. Who can tell me? Well, that's not strictly true. There is one other. It's actually honeybees. But anyway, plants are the only organism which make their own food. What do we call, what's the word we used for the plants when they produce their own food? Can anyone tell me? We gave them a special name last week. Who can tell me? What did we call that? We had a special name. Anyone remember? It begins with P.
Producer.
You're absolutely right. Fantastic. It is producer. So that there's only generally very few producers on the planet Earth. Honeybees are one. They make their own food. But almost every living plant, any plant that photosynthesizes, any plant that uses energy from the sun will be making its own food. And that is called a producer. So for us, what we do know is that all the energy for every other organism on this planet only comes from one place. It comes from producers, and those are plants. Now, also, there are different kinds of bacteria. There are plankton, and there are other things which also photosynthesize. They also make their own food, but we count those, we call those plants as well, okay? So an ecosystem, whether it's desert, tundra, marine, whatever it may be, all of those ecosystems have animals which are producers or organisms which are producers. And all the living things in those ecosystems take that energy from the sun. And the energy then moves from the plants around the ecosystem. It moves around the ecosystem. So how does the energy move around the ecosystem? Can anyone remember from last week, we talked about how the energy goes from producers to the last animal in the ecosystem. Can anyone remember the name of that line? What was the name of the line from the producer to the last animal in the ecosystem? We called it what? A food what? What did we call it? That single line. What did we call that? Anyone remember? Have a go. We called it what? That line from producers like grass to the end of that line. What did we call that line?
Food chain.
Brilliant. Who said that again? Who said that?
Alpha.
Alpha. Very good, Alpha. You're absolutely right. We called it a food chain. And we also talked about last week when we have many food chains, we call it a food web. So Pasa Angrit, food chain, and food web. Pasatai is here. Okay. So when we have many food chains, we call it food webs, food chain and food webs. And that's how the energy moves from producers like grass, wheat, plant, plankton, bacteria, to other organisms in the food chain. And then last week we talked about a food chain. We said energy will move from this side of the food chain, len sai, to the right side of the food chain, and energy moves that way. That's how animals live. That's how organisms live. They take the energy from one side of the food chain and then from other organisms in the food chain. And we talked last week about how the food chains and food webs have different things. We have, what do we call the animals, the organisms that eat the producers or eat other organisms? Can anyone remember this name in English? Pasa Angrit. What do we call the animals that eat other organisms? What do we call them? Can anyone remember? What do we call it? It's called a what? Nung Song Sam?
Consumer.
Consumer. You're absolutely right. All together, please. Nung Song Sam?
Consumer.
Consumer.
I'd like everybody to say it together, please. That means everybody on this call, and I can see your microphone so I know who's speaking, okay? I'd like everyone on this call to say it. Okay, Nung Song Sam?
Consumer.
Okay, Kawan, I don't think your baby elephant is saying anything. Put your baby elephant down, please, so I can see your little face. Thank you very much indeed. Okay, Best, do you have a camera? If you can turn your camera on, please, I'd be grateful. Thank you. Okay, Kawan, can you put your elephant down? Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Very appreciated. Okay, so one more time. Consumer. Nung Song Sam?
Consumer.
Very good. Excellent, everybody. Very good. That's what I wanted to hear. Okay, so it's consumer. And we said there are 3 types of consumer. Can anyone remember the name of one type of consumer?
Carnivore.
Carnivore. Carnivore. You're absolutely right. Can you tell me?
Herbivore.
Herbivore. Absolutely right. And then there was one more. What was it?
Omnivore.
Omnivore. You're absolutely right. So when we talked about the carnivore, what kind of food does a carnivore eat?
Other animal.
A carnivore or a herbivore. Well, a herbivore eats only plants. You're right. A carnivore eats only animals. And what do we call it when the consumer eats plants and animals? What do we call it when the consumer eats plants and animals? Who can remember? Anyone?
Omnivore.
Omnivore. Alpha, you got it absolutely right. You're a genius. It is alpha. Very, very good. It is exactly that. It is an omnivore. So herbivore, carnivore, omnivore. Herbivores eat only plants. Carnivores eat only animals. And omnivores eat both. And when we looked at the example last week, we talked about the food chain of an owl. Now, just to remind ourselves again, one more time, what is always the very first thing, the very first organism in our food chain? Kawan, what's the very first thing in the food chain? Always. Can you remember?
Plant.
Plant, you're absolutely right. You're a genius. Well done. It's always going to be a plant. Yep, you're absolutely right. It's always going to be a plant. Oops, where's my slide? Okay, it's always going to be a plant. And then next we talked about, in this case, it was going to be another organism. Now, would that be eating the plant? Would it be a herbivore or a carnivore?
Herbivore.
No, it wouldn't be a carnivore, it would be a herbivore. So we have a producer, which is the plant, the herbivore, which is eating the plant, and then we would have an omnivore or a carnivore eating the insect. And then finally, we have the carnivore, which in this case is the owl. So when we look at the entire food chain and all of the food chain, all of the food web, we remind ourselves that sunlight goes into the plant by photosynthesis. And that begins the moving of energy from the sun into the plant, the energy from the plant into the insect, the herbivore, then from the insect into the mouse, and then from the mouse to the owl. And then the energy when the owl dies, remember we said when the owl dies, all of that energy will go back into the earth. And then it will go back here. It will go back to where we have all the energy being eaten again or taken by the plant. So let's look at this one more time. Energy from the sun into the plant. The energy goes into the plant, and then the fruit and the leaves are eaten by insects or other animals. The energy from that insect then goes to this mouse or another animal. And then the energy from this mouse then goes into this owl. And then finally, when the owl dies, it will decompose. We have decomposers. Decomposers. Now, I'd like to say that one more time clearly for everyone. Decomposers. Nương Song Sam?
Decompose.
Everyone together,
Decomposer.
please. Everyone together. When I say three. Nương Song Sam?
Decomposer.
Right, decomposers. So the decomposers, which are bacteria, fungi, and worms, they break down, they eat the dead animal, and then all the nutrients, all the material from the dead animal go back into the ground, and then the cycle begins again. All of the energy just goes around in a big circle.